Okay. Hey everyone, good afternoon. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today for this virtual session on nonprofit shared services. Really glad you could be here. As you know, we are trying to socialize this concept as much as possible at the Nonprofit Center. We are deeply invested in exploring our infrastructure and our ability to provide a shared services program to our Nonprofit Center membership base. So we're excited you're here to learn more. And I'm going to pretty quickly throw it over to our wonderful friend and our partner so far in this work, Thaddeus Squire. He's with Social Impact Commons, and you may have seen him a few months back when we had him out to lead a session around fiscal sponsorship specifically. But he has a ton of great, knowledge and expertise and background in this work. And we have been very fortunate to be contracting with them to help us do this exploration. So Thaddeus, I'm going to hand it on over to you.
Thank you, Callan, and the team at the Nonprofit Center. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today, and thank you for using what I hope or presume is a lunch hour for a lot of you to lunch and learn. But today we are going to look at a spectrum of shared services models, and we're going to skip over all of the philosophizing and case for it because I think we're all here because we know that lots of things are changing in the sector. There's a lot of stress and strain in our sector today, and sharing things is in the air and certainly is something that's always been practiced, but is really accelerating in terms of interest and need in our sector. So we're going to look at a spectrum of models. There is not just one way to do this. There is a variety of ways, and then look at some rough comparisons of how they lay out on a number of with regard to a number of factors and axes. And then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. Um, we're going to break this up into kind of two sections. So if you could put questions in the chat, we could log them there, but we will be holding some time for questions as we go, hopefully. But this is going to be a fast ride because we only have 60 minutes. And we want to get you out of here on time. So with that, let's dive right in. So just to kind of level set here, we're really trying to figure out how can we be more efficient as a sector? How can we achieve greater economies of scale while still embracing the plurality and independence that the nonprofit sector represents, which we think is a strength and a great thing. How can we solve certain kind of capitalization problems in investing in infrastructure to support mission-related work? How can we reduce the cost of having to do like outsourcing and contracting and searching for new service providers all the time, which has always been a challenge in our sector? And finally, how do we remove, barriers to learning and collaboration within the sector so that we can work together towards more shared impacts for our communities? So this is kind of the rough problem we're looking to solve here. What do we mean by shared services? I think just to also get clear on this front is important. Um, there are really sort of two component parts that are important to understand together. They're both integral to each other. So there is the stuff that humans do. So these are all of the jobs that we need people who have expertise to do: finance, accounting, HR, marketing, fundraising, etc., IT support. So there's the human side, and then there's the sort of inanimate infrastructure that we need to support all that. So corporate forms, tax status, insurance policies, benefit packages, software and technology systems, all of those things that the humans use to kind of implement the administrative and other management support that's needed. So just wanted to kind of, this may be self-evident, but just wanted to be clear that these are the things that we're talking about sharing. And we're choosing today to look at the models and the spectrum of options in sort of two buckets, or in terms of two sides of the spectrum. On the one hand, you've got arm's length type relationships and services, where you have fully independent parties, organizations at the table You have separate management and governance, separate compliance obligations. And we're going to look at fiscal sponsorship, the Model C form today. And for those that haven't been to past orientations of fiscal sponsorship, we're going to do a quick primer in what these are. So we will explain what these terms mean. Technical assistance is the other big area of or big practice of arm's length support um, provided by alliances and associations largely out there, as well as integrated supports. And on the other side, the integrated side of the equation really sort of combines corporate and other legal infrastructure. Management is much closer, it's co-management. In many cases, compliance is consolidated as well into kind of one entity. And the examples of these models are comprehensive or Model A fiscal sponsorship, as well as mergers and acquisitions. Yeah, we are aware that there are also going to be a number of conversations in your community about mergers and acquisitions, or M&A as it's called in short form. But these are fiscal sponsorship is something that is offered by management commons orgs, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute. But this is the more integrated side of the spectrum. So we're going to be looking at 4 solutions today, 2 that are arm's length and 2 that are integrated, and sort of comparing them. Just to be clear, whoops, let me go back here. We're not making a case that any one of these is better than another. We simply want to lay them out in a comparative fashion for you so that you can think about them in your own context as potential users or partners to the Alliance in accessing these kinds of resources. Because what we're trying to suss out in the Northeast Florida community is what is the range of these models that the center might want to offer to be able to respond to the various needs in the community. So this is really just kind of a straightforward comparative exercise here. So let's start with the 2 arm's length models that I mentioned. So Model C or pre-approved grant fiscal sponsorship is probably the most common form or commonly known form. It really it's trying to solve the problem of how do I get a startup nonprofit without a tax letter yet, or a non-exempt entity, maybe somebody has an LLC or is doing business as an artist or a worker in the community, for example. How do they get access to charitable funds, donations, and grants? And so in Model C fiscal sponsorship, it really only is concerning those contributed income sources. The sponsor, in this case, this would be the Alliance, is a nonprofit organization. It agrees to receive charitable funds on behalf of a project, and we use the term project to denote the operating kind of unit that is being sponsored. The project's the green circle in the lower left here. The sponsor receives the grant or donation and then re-grants it down to the individual or the entity that's not exempt, that is holding and doing the actual charitable work, whatever that happens to be. And that person and that entity is paying all the bills, hiring the vendors, the staff, et cetera. There is a reporting and accountability line back up to the funding sources through the sponsor. All of this is enshrined in a fiscal sponsorship agreement. And that is the kind of structure of the relationship. This is used to move funds very quickly to the front line in cases of emergency. It's also used for temporary projects or startup nonprofits, as I mentioned. But this is a common form of fiscal sponsorship because there's 2 entities. It's an arm's length relationship. The other arm's length approach is technical assistance, and this is widespread in the sector. There are many associations and alliances that offer this, and this is quite simply fee for service. This is a nonprofit hiring another nonprofit. In this case, the provider would be the alliance. They would be hiring in staff to do bookkeeping, HR support, grant writing, whatever the services are that they want to offer. And those services are provided to separate nonprofits at an arm's length for usually a fee. That fee may be below market, it may be subsidized, or it may be fully on parity with market. It really depends on the situation. But this is a very simple fee-for-service relationship at the end of the day. And is quite similar. Some people call this outsourcing. Outsourcing is a much broader term, usually refers to hiring largely for-profit service providers like law firms or accounting firms. The word technical assistance is most commonly used in the nonprofit sector to denote sort of nonprofit to nonprofit services. So just a note on that language. So those are the two arm's length approaches. Now to the two integrated approaches. So Model A fiscal sponsorship or comprehensive fiscal sponsorship is an approach to sharing nonprofit infrastructure where the operating the nonprofit organization or project or program becomes essentially a project of the sponsor. It's an in-house program. You see the green circle inside the sponsor here. And as such, they share all of the backbone infrastructure that the sponsor would use to support its other programs. So you're essentially plugging into a full service nonprofit backbone, with the exception that the project in this case is unlike the other programs in the sponsor org. For example, the center has other programs that are longstanding that it offers the community. You as a project under the Alliance would retain your identity. You have your own website, you keep your name, you keep all the things that the public sees as your identity. You have a lot of agency over your financial mission, vision, how you run your programs. That remains pretty autonomous. And most importantly, you have the right to exit at any time. So in any fiscal sponsorship relationship, the project can essentially reverse the relationship and leave at its accord if it's not working out or no longer kind of useful to the project. So you retain your autonomy legally and otherwise, and that's very important. But in this model, the project is sharing comprehensive back office services, which are finance, HR, legal, compliance, and insurances at the core. And there's often a la carte or additional things offered by sponsors. So this is an all-in model. And the sponsor is receiving all income on behalf of the project, paying all bills on behalf of the project, including being the employer of record, being the compliance and ensure responsible party for the project in this case. So all of the liability and risk is really concentrated and managed by the sponsor, but the project retains its autonomy and its ability to leave. Finally, under our integrated options, we have mergers and acquisitions, or M&A. I might use that as a short form. And these are two separate things. And they entail a merger, quite simply, is the combination, the complete combination of two, in this case, nonprofit organizations. Mergers, of course, exist generally in the world, in the private sector as well. But in a nonprofit context, it really is no different. There is one organization, the green on the right with the dotted line, that is often called the non-surviving organization or non-survivor, meaning it goes away when the merger is consummated legally. It is absorbed into the survivor organization and becomes an integral part. Whatever its assets are, its programs are, in many cases, its staff, all become just simply part of the new organization. And so that's why there's a dotted line around the circle on the right there. An acquisition is somewhat similar, but it's a little lighter in that the program seller or donor organization remains in existence, but it simply is moving a program or a certain set of assets. It could be, say, a piece of real estate, or it could be a program they've done for a long time, but they want to hand that program over to another organization to manage. That would be an acquisition. And so in this case, only the program or the asset is moving to the acquirer organization on the left. I want to note, we're including this in this kind of spectrum just to be as holistic as possible. But just to be clear, we're not proposing that the alliance is a party to be merged with willy-nilly. Mergers and acquisitions tend to be two-party transactions. They tend to be between two organizations, and they don't really they rarely happen at greater scale than that. And in talking about this model, we're not necessarily proposing that the alliance is the organization on the left, just to be clear. But these could be any number of organizations, any two organizations in your community might think about doing this kind of work, either merging or acquiring or transferring certain programs and assets, depending on what your goals are and what the circumstances denote. But that's what these two models mean, and that's what we mean by mergers and acquisitions. In this case, unlike in just to compare these two integrated supports, well, we'll talk about that in a minute, because we have a comparison chart. But in most cases, the intention is that this is not reversible. So once you merge, it's rare that would be undone at some later date. The mergers are one way, kind of permanent. Same for acquisitions. It is unusual that there is a reversibility or clawback written into an acquisition agreement. So with regard to all four of these, the two arm's length and the two integrated that we talked about, there are kind of two basic use cases we see out there in the landscape. One is startup nonprofits, so new programs, new projects, things that don't yet have their own nonprofit entity. And the other is established nonprofits that might be looking for greater efficiencies, might be going through some adversity and looking for options to kind of stabilize. There may be also programmatic or front-facing reasons for existing nonprofits to want to kind of combine their infrastructure and their programs so that they can multiply their impact. There are lots of reasons, but there are kind of the two cases we see fall into these two buckets. And broadly, sharing resources, the value proposition is kind of the same to both, but there are different considerations depending on whether you're just starting up and you don't have your own formation versus nonprofits that are already established. Those are two different cases to think about. And in the former, we see fiscal sponsorship for startups being a sort of go-to approach, as in some cases an alternative to forming their own nonprofit. Particularly Model A can be a permanent alternative to being your own nonprofit. Established orgs have a little bit more of a choice about what's the right fit for them. Is it arm's length or is it a more integrated approach? So those are the models, and I'm just going to go back to this slide and pause for a second. Are there any questions about sort of those four models, the two arm's length and the two integrated that we talked about? Before we go on to the balance of what I want to present is really just sort of comparing these on a number of different levels so that you really get a sense of what the issues are and the considerations are for your particular needs in the community. But we're doing well on time, so I wanted to hold a little space for
I
questions.
just think it's very interesting. I didn't know that you could just give up one piece without giving up everything that you are. So I learned that. That's very good.
Yeah, if you have a program you don't want anymore, but it's still a valuable program, you could find somebody else to transfer it to. And that's depending, sometimes that's done in a quasi-commercial way. There's a payment for that in some cases. That's not terribly common in the nonprofit space. Usually it's one nonprofit essentially donating that program to another. But the nature of that transaction is actually an acquisition agreement. So, moving that program to them, just like you're buying anything out there. So that's the formal way that happens. Yeah. Any other questions? I'm happy to go back to any of these previous slides to clarify things. Clear as mud, I see. All right. Here we go. Well, let's move on and do some comparisons here. So I'm going to array these, from left to right. These slides, the next few slides are kind of set up in a similar way to look at the arm's length solutions on the left. And for these kind of schematics, I've combined the two arm's lengths into the graphic on the far left here. And the two integrated approaches are in the middle and right. And we're just going to kind of walk through these a little bit and look at some of the dynamics and considerations. So generally, there's a spectrum of difference in terms of cost to operate. So cost to both the project or program or user and efficiency as you move from arm's length to integrated. And the basic reason for that is in most arm's length relationships, there is a sunk cost in actually holding multiple entities. You don't start to get real cost savings until you start eliminating the need for multiple entities out there, because the entity itself has a fixed cost for compliance, for keeping it alive, for carrying and feeding it, that starts to reduce as you move right to more integrated solutions. Also, in the arm's length world, you are dealing with essentially fee for service relationships. And so in some cases, if you're dealing with a for-profit, there's a profit margin you're paying for on any hourly fee you're paying for that service. In the nonprofit space, there still needs to be full cost recovery in some way. So either a funder is subsidizing or the nonprofit service provider has to charge essentially a market rate for those services. So you're going to get a little less efficiency because you've got multiple entities involved and you've got this kind of arm's length, essentially kind of almost a commercial relationship between the two entities. We see a lot of technical service organizations, technical assistance organizations. So this TAO is really just a generic term for, in this case, what the alliance would be. Providing technical assistance. Many of them also offer Model C fiscal sponsorship alongside that for people who need that. None of these are, these are not mutually exclusive. You can engage in multiple of these solutions, with the exception of mergers and acquisitions. Those are, that's sort of as I said, a one-way street. So just to be, clear, the more you retain corporate independence, the higher your costs and lower efficiency goes. The more you're willing to integrate corporate and systems on the right, the more efficient and lower the costs go. And that doesn't necessarily mean that one is better than the other. That's just a factor to consider. So drilling down into that a little bit. So as I said, on the left with our arm's length solutions, we've got higher fully loaded costs because you've got two entities kind of doing business with each other. They can be subsidized, but you also have all those duplicated systems. So you've got two accounting systems. You've got the service providers and you've got the client in this case, instead of one accounting system. As you move across, fully loaded costs get distributed a little bit more and go down. There can also be some subsidy for those costs as well, if philanthropy is willing to do that. And you've got much more unified systems, policies, and practices as you start to reduce the number of entities. And I'll note, this it's subtle but very significant difference between the Model A fiscal sponsorship solution and the merger and acquisition solution. With Model A, you get pretty much all of the efficiencies that you get with a merger and acquisition, except you also get to retain your identity, your independence, and you can leave anytime you want. Whereas a merger, those things, usually you're giving up your identity if you're the non-surviving organization. And once it's done, it's done. You really can't kind of reverse it, or it's very difficult to do so, and is usually not the case. So that's just looking sort of broadly at the operations. we get a lot of questions around like, well, what is it like between all of these across the spectrum to operate day to day? So if I'm a program or a project, if my organization becomes a Model A fiscal sponsee or is a technical assistance receiver, um, what's the reality? And the reality is the day-to-day operations are pretty much the same, just like the operations run as any nonprofit or any kind of entity would run its operations. Um, the project or the client organization is sort of leading and defining what it needs, what the services are. It's negotiating scopes and contracts and such, and those are approved and kind of managed up by the service provider or the fiscal sponsor in this case. So this is this is a little bit of like a workflow here, items 1 through 6. We don't need to go into all the kind of detail. I think you probably get the picture, but wanted to include this just to note that there isn't a huge difference in across the spectrum in how you kind of operate day to day in terms of your general needs. But there are, as I mentioned, efficiencies to consider across the spectrum. So on the arm's length solution on the left, you're operating multiple policies, multiple management practices because you've got multiple entities that are separate. You've got multiple insurance policies to pay for. Once you move into integrated models, for example, Model A fiscal sponsorship, you could have 100 organizations sharing one nonprofit backbone. There is one insurance policy. There is one audit. There is one 990 as opposed to 100 990s. So once you integrate systems, be it through Model A fiscal sponsorship or a merger and acquisition, all of that redundancy goes away and you've got a lot more both operational efficiency as well as economic efficiency. So you're paying for only one audit, not 100 audits as a field or as a community. So and finally, let's look at sort of risk and compliance. With arm's length relationships, of course, risk is completely segregated because you've got completely sovereign entities in relationship to each other. They're independent formations. When you integrate supports, you are sharing and integrating those risks legally. And so that's just a consideration. That's in many cases more of a consideration for the sponsor, but it's also something to think about for the project in the Model A case. And of course, with mergers and acquisitions, that's why a lot of due diligence is done before a merger or an acquisition is consummated to make sure that the risks that are being taken on by the surviving organization or the acquirer are things it's prepared to handle and manage. Today, we're not going into all of the kind of preparatory and due diligence considerations for all of these. Those do exist, but we just wanted to give folks a high-level kind of introduction. So a few sort of summary, we have a few summary tables here, just looking at all of this in a tabular form. So broadly, arm's length is a bit more expensive to deliver than integration because you don't get the economies of scale you get with integration. I'm accepting mergers and acquisitions because I would hope at this point you can see that as a somewhat exceptional case. But it's one that exists on this spectrum for your consideration. The cost to the user because of the cost to deliver is a little bit higher at arm's length overall than in an integrated form using comprehensive sponsorship. As I mentioned, the operating experience and kind of independence of identity is no different across these two things, two sides of the spectrum, setting aside M&A. Decision making in arm's length is completely separate. You've got two sovereign organizations. Whereas in the integrated approach, it is more of a co-management. So it's mostly separate. You're running your programs in your organization, but the sponsor for comprehensive sponsorship is setting basic policies, practices, and operating procedures that all projects that share its backbone are essentially sharing and taking advantage of. So it's not completely independent, but it's largely separate or independent. Risk and legal separation, arm's length, as I said, is separate, completely integrated, true to its name. There is legal sharing happening there. So both risks and other factors. And in both cases, with the exception of M&A, there's a high degree for the project or client to determine, their own exit. So drilling down, that's sort of an overall, summary between the arm's length and integrated sides, but looking now at each of these four solutions side by side. So looking at the relationship and the supports, so services, Model C is really only about access to grants and gifts. Fiscal sponsorship, but that's something that's becoming tremendously useful for a lot of communities, particularly with temporary projects or new startup organizations emerging in response to the needs. Technical assistance can vary widely from accounting and bookkeeping to HR to grant writing to strategy and sort of more management consulting type services. It's highly variable, as you can imagine. Model A is really comprehensive administration. It's shared back office support is the real core there. And then with a merger and acquisition, really it's not a service relationship anymore. You've simply combined the organizations, and so you've really got a fully integrated administrative structure there. Ability to exit, as we've said, changes quite dramatically across the spectrum. In arm's length, of course, either the project in the fiscal sponsorship relationship or the client certainly can exit anytime they want. Likewise, with the comprehensive sponsorship, Model A, fiscal sponsorship, the project can exit. Merger, it's a one-way street. The legal relationships across this board in Model C, it's a re-granting agreement or a fiscal sponsorship agreement. Technical assistance is essentially a fee-for-service contract that you have that defines the services and what you're paying for them and other terms. For Model A fiscal sponsorship, it's a fiscal sponsorship agreement that likewise defines the services you're getting, what you're paying for it, and how the relationship is going to be operationalized. And in a merger and acquisition, there's either an acquisition agreement or a merger agreement that essentially consummates the combining of resources there. Decision-making, likewise, is changes across the spectrum from, we would say, collaborative in the Model C relationship to client-directed for technical assistance. So that's just like any vendor relationship. You're saying, this is what I need, and the vendor is saying, I can provide that under these terms. With comprehensive fiscal or sponsorship or Model A fiscal sponsorship, it is a co-management relationship because the fiscal sponsor is managing the back office, but you are managing everything in the front of house, all of your programs and your front-facing relationships, funders, beneficiaries, et cetera. And in a merger or an acquisition, it's fully integrated. You are simply part of the organization, and your identity, the identity that it existed before, as a separate entity goes away. Risk allocation follows suit. You can see that spectrum, logically progress from very segregated to fully integrated. Same thing with the kind of legal entities involved. In arm's length, there's always at least two entities, whereas as you move to the right in integrated, some of those entities start to go away or are put into dormancy. So if you are an established nonprofit, you can move your operations into a Model A fiscal sponsorship relationship. There, it's not about the tax status, it's about wanting to share that back office infrastructure. And this is one of the models that the Alliance is looking at potentially providing for those who are interested. In that case, the pre-existing or the nonprofit that's moving into the fiscal sponsor, you could wind up the entity itself, or you could keep it essentially in a dormant form, so that if you ever want to leave, you can just go back to operating the way you did before. So that's possible in Model A fiscal sponsorship. And of course, with a merger, you're pretty committed. Lastly, we just want to look, and this is our last, I believe, our last slide here, or next to last slide. We're looking at, what is look at just sort of cost. What does this mean financially? So at the top, cost to implement really refers to what does it take to put this in place, to set it up for the user or the client or the customer, the sponsored project. For Model C, there's not a lot of cost once the program's in place with the sponsor. It's a pretty easy thing to become fiscally sponsored as a Model C sponsee. Technical assistance, of course, the cost to set it up varies with scope, but is also not huge. That's about getting into a service agreement with the provider. Model A, there's a little bit more due diligence on either side because it is a co-management and an integrated relationship. So there's a little bit more care that needs to go into that. So there's a little bit more expense. And finally, mergers and acquisitions tend to be rather expensive because those do generally necessitate lawyers and specific kinds of agreements and filings to be done. So there's some fairly heavy financial and legal costs to do a merger and acquisition transaction. Once you're in the relationship, the cost to the user or clients or the ongoing cost also follows a similar pattern. Model C it tends not to be that expensive. It's if you see 2 lines down, it is usually assessed on a percent of revenue. So it's essentially a kind of tax model, if you will. With technical assistance, that varies with subsidy. So it could be, done as a retainer basis or an hourly time and materials basis, and that depends on what the provider wants to charge. For Model A fiscal sponsorship, the cost is 10 to 15% of revenue, generally. Mergers, there's not really, it's not a cost per se in a service sense. You are just integrated into the operations once you've merged with the surviving organization. Going back up a line to the economies of scale, this is an important thing to consider both individually but also as a community, that Model C fiscal sponsors can take on hundreds, some have thousands of Model C sponsees under one umbrella, in this case, prospectively the Alliance. Technical assistance has some scale. It's a little more limited because it is a fee-for-service model in terms of the economies you get. And the reason it's limited is that the cost of an hour to provide a service is constant no matter how many people are utilizing that service. Once you get over into the integrated models of fiscal sponsorship and mergers, you're essentially sharing internal FTEs, and you get a bit more efficiency there. And this is not billed strictly on an hourly basis. So there's a little bit higher economy of scale possible once you sort of integrate systems as well. You don't have as much friction by having 2 accounting systems that are operating side by side. You've got one accounting system. You don't have 2 separate policies for spend management. You have one policy for spend management. So you get a lot more economies as you integrate. And finally, following that same logic, business model integration moves from essentially no level of integration, you're just arm's length, to a high degree of integration. And same thing with like general operational efficiencies. So how you manage day to day. There's a limited degree to which you can get that from arm's length, a higher degree to which you can get that when you integrate systems. So just as a note, we see, and this is a bit of our, this is our opinion. I'm not stating this as fact, but we certainly believe that mergers and acquisitions have a time and place, and there's some very good cases for those out there. So it is an essential tool in the tool belt. But because nonprofits leaders really tend to favor their independence and their identity. And we actually think that's part of what drives this sector. That's a value that gets people up in the morning, that gets them to work to do this stuff. And in that regard, comprehensive Model A fiscal sponsorship kind of strikes a very nice balance between getting a lot of the benefits of a merger, that real integrated efficiency and economy of scale, while preserving independence and agency and identity, the things that people really care about. And it's also much more cost effective to do than a two at a time sort of merger and acquisition transaction. So M&A is not scalable unto itself. We typically don't see 100 organizations merging with each other at once. It's usually kind of two at a time, maybe three at a time. But there's much more limited scale there. Again, this is not saying one's better than the other. We just think that if we're looking at shared infrastructure and sharing at scale, comprehensive fiscal sponsorship offers a more amenable solution than M&A. And it is much more efficient and impactful than, say, arm's length services. But both sides, both parties really need to be comfortable with what that entails. And so I want to close with just like a couple, predictions, which I think we're all feeling, and then we can spend the balance of time answering questions. As we see the kind of pressures and stresses on our sector grow, we're seeing a lot of interest. We're not yet tracking this in any kind of scientific way, but interest from funders using fiscal sponsors as intermediaries to move money to charitable work that might be politically or socially sensitive, so that they can keep funding that work, but be a little bit removed from it. We're also hearing that the IRS is encountering a lot of challenges in getting new organization applications through the tax-exempt process. So we're seeing more and more new nonprofits reach for fiscal sponsorship as an alternative instead of starting their own. And finally, of course, as we've heard Dawn and others talk about, and we're hearing this in all the communities working in, the strains on the sector are really kind of pushing folks to think differently about their costs. And there are some organizations, we're going to see a lot of organizations go away, I think, unfortunately. And so either mergers and acquisitions or comprehensive sponsorship becomes kind of an alternative restructuring a way to lower costs, but remain operational or keep the programs and work going where they're valued. And finally, we're going to see some of this work exit the sector, meaning go into a private context, taxable context, but perhaps rely on things like Model C fiscal sponsorship to still access occasionally charitable funds from foundations or donors. So all of these forces, these are things that we're starting to see in response to our current climate. But all of this, recommends due considerations of these various options. So with that, love to open up the floor for questions and happy to go back and look at any of those previous slides.
I was just curious, are you able to discuss types of mergers? I mean, can you give us any examples that you've seen? And that might be a wide open question, sorry.
Well, there are mergers tend to, if you one way to think about the kind of difference between like Model A fiscal sponsorship and mergers generally entail have both a programmatic logic, in both cases there has to be a mission logic. There needs to be some kind of ability to kind of understand that there's a mission match there in values and otherwise. But with the comprehensive sponsorship approach, Model A sponsorship, you're really just merging the back end. So if we look at, the back of house versus the front of house, the front of house is remaining independent, but the back of house is getting merged and made more efficient. With a true merger and acquisition, you really need both. It's both the back of house and there's got to be a front-facing reason for it. And so, we see much more merger and acquisition work in areas of the nonprofit sector that are not um, kind of idiocentric is the only word I can use, like arts and culture. It rarely makes sense to merge two theater organizations because part of why they're different are different artistic visions. But we do see mergers happen in health and human services, where there might be very clear shared programmatic goals like housing the unhoused or curing a particular disease or alleviating poverty in a certain part of the city. And if you have three organizations or two organizations that really are close in what they do programmatically and who they serve, it may make sense for both the programs and the operations to be in fact merged. And so for a merger to happen, there really needs to be a strong programmatic and kind of program model logic, which is not as necessary or essential to, say, just sharing the back office under comprehensive fiscal sponsorship. But I've seen examples in Philly in the health and human services that are of the nature I just described. It's really like, um, it's happened a fair amount in the housing field, two organizations that are really focused on low-income housing, just saying, let's pull our resources together. We're going to have a stronger portfolio, stronger balance sheet. We're both focused on Southwest Philadelphia. Why should we be operating separately? Let's get more efficiencies in the back as well in terms of our administration. Does that help?
Yes, great. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
Nothing else from anyone?
I guess I'm curious, Thaddeus, just, how much movement are you seeing? I know you've been successful in working with like arts and music organizations. How much of this are you seeing around the country, around the state?
It's we're seeing a fair amount of movement, from our primary work is with the fiscal sponsorship world. We're occasionally involved. M&A work is, I would say, a very distant second to us. I believe Dawn's going to bring in La Piana, or so there's a number of organizations and firms that really specialize in M&A. We are, I think, still at the beginning of people trying to understand what the ramifications are. So we're seeing movement. We're seeing discussions of organizations wanting to move, existing nonprofits wanting to move under Model A sponsors as a safe harbor. And in some cases, I've seen a number of cases where essentially they want to go dormant and sort of ride out, if you will, the administration, but they don't want to wind up completely because they don't want to kind of toss away. They've got IP or other reasons, so they're coming under a sponsor to be essentially a kind of almost like a warehouse solution. Those are organizations that were really primarily federally government funded that just kind of were dealt a blow that they couldn't recover from. Ones that weren't so acutely affected are really thinking about how can we trim as much as possible on an admin and other overhead. We don't have, I don't know if La Piana has kind of current stats on activity, but we've seen upticks certainly reported from philanthropy in terms of what they're getting grant requests for. And so all the things you can imagine we're seeing happen, but we're yet to really have a firm grip on what the scale of repositioning is going to look like, because lots of funding is still being litigated, and people are waiting that outcome. And we just had the House the bill go through, so people are now trying to figure out what is that going to mean for giving and philanthropy, given the provisions in there. So there's still a lot of unknowns, even though there's been so much turmoil over the last 6 months. I think it's going to take another at least 12 months for us to have a clearer picture of how things are moving.
Hey, Thaddeus. Thank you so much for an Awesome program as always. And I just wanted to kind of put an exclamation point on what you just shared. I think we're probably not going back to the way that the sector was operating and the way that funding streams were being dispersed. And so now is the time for all of us to be thinking about what does the future of this work look like? And, even if the funding streams come back and the levers get turned on, are there systems of efficiency that we need to be putting in place for the next time something happens? And it may not have anything to do politically. It could be another pandemic. It could be something else that is unpredicted. So I think, how do we leverage the resources that are being made available to us right now through this type of thinking and infrastructure to figure out how do we build a different model? We're using the term kintsugi, which is the Japanese pottery where you break it and put it back together with gold and it makes something even more beautiful, as kind of a metaphor to think about how we can shape the sector in a different way. So I encourage people not to wait, and think, really educating your boards, invite your boards of directors to attend these workshops and help them to learn. Many times we find that it's the board of directors that often stand in the way of these kinds of opportunities. So how can you educate them? So I appreciate everybody being here.
Yeah, I +1 to that. 100%. I think there's a lot of there's a lot of soul searching that has just begun for the sector to figure out what is its political economic position moving forward. I don't think I completely agree. We're not going to go back to a December 2024 status. I'm in this sector because I believe that the third sector is where is the place where civil society happens and is most stable. I do still believe that, and I think that will continue to be the case. To put a little bit of an optimistic, spin on it. We have 1.8 million nonprofits out there doing this work in local communities. We are not going to see all that go away, but we're going to see a lot of kind of new thinking about how it's structured, I think. And probably a greater emphasis towards localism, which I don't think is a bad thing. P.S. I'm going to say that just as a personal opinion. Because I think we have such a diverse and wide, far-flung country, and I do believe that problems are best solved closest to where they are.
That's right.
And I think that's a fundamental tenet of commoning. That's not a political opinion. That's actually my sort of economic perspective. So I think that there's a great value that particularly local, that's why we really like to work at this kind of local community level, such as with you all, because that's where the magic happens. But in looking at all of this, I know this is a lot to take in. If you're coming back to your desk or your board or whatever, I think if you're looking at M&A, you probably, if you don't know or can't think of an organization where you've already said, gee, we're doing something really close to them, we should be working together, you probably, M&A might not be the path for you. Typically, that is a case where you've got 2, maybe 3 organizations that know each other's work, where there's really obvious, very clear overlaps and redundancies, and you want to work together to reduce that. So that's just one filter. If you're just sitting there going, well, I can't think of an organization like that in our community here, but I do want to think about how I can be more efficient with my resources, and I want to think about how not just to be efficient, but also build my capacity. So I don't want to frame this whole conversation in sort of a diminishing or, how can we kind of collapse things, but also think about this as real collective capacity building. Thinking about it more constructively and the ability to come together and share things and actually grow, not just contract. So I want to put that's something that we haven't been talking about because of just the tenor of the day. But that's an important, I think we can grow amidst all of this unrest. So if that's you, I want to think about how to build my capacity, maybe get more efficient, then you're thinking on this spectrum of the arm's length to kind of comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, that sort of left 3/4 of that spectrum that I presented. So if you want to sort yourself broadly, that would be my advice, in your own thinking moving forward about whether any of this is for you or relevant to your organization. That makes sense.
I just had one quick question if we have a couple more minutes. What I've seen in our space, specifically across the state, a lot of mergers come with organizations that are in crisis typically, and a rescuing organization comes in historically versus it being more strategic, which I think is what we're talking about today. Are there situations where, the financial gain of something more arm's length isn't enough, where it has to be that? I mean, are there situations where the financial benefit kind of requires something more extreme, or is that not typically the case? Or
A great question. Well, I mean, first of all, there is some science or study out there that unfortunately the nonprofit sector really mostly uses M&A as a crisis management tool, whereas the for-profit sector mostly uses it as a strategic growth tool, right? So we have to kind of just sit with that for a second in our sector, right? And mergers are actually not terribly ideal when it's under duress. There's an old saying that, two one-legged people does not a two-legged person make, but in terms of efficiencies, though, you're right. I mean, when you look at the hard economics of all of this, you do not start getting efficiencies until you start getting rid of entities. Period. That's for some, I think, the hard truth. Because you have that baseline duplication of systems and costs, and all of it cascades from there. You've got compliance, you've got you get all that stuff. And what you get with TA arm's length is you get certain efficiencies in sourcing and management, right? And you might be able to kind of do more quality control, and some things that are perennial challenges for organizations that mostly outsource today can be solved through centralizing that. So I think that's a serious solution that the center is looking at for that reason, right? So there's some gains. But if you're really talking about operating efficiencies, you've got to start to integrate and get rid of entities. And I got into the field of fiscal sponsorship because, coming from the arts world, nobody wants to merge because it makes no sense in the arts world, because the arts are all idiosyncratic, right? Every arts organization exists because of some human's individual vision. There's no merger logic, in my opinion. I've rarely seen it, just because of the nature of what it is, right? Whereas if there's an external thing motivating what you're doing, like housing or poverty alleviation, then there might be more objective reason to kind of bring organizations together. But that's why, sort of in the middle of that spectrum, that the Comprehensive Fiscal Sponsorship Forum does, we think, strike a really lovely balance between allowing people to retain their independence and agency, but dedupe a lot of that infrastructure. I'm a pluralist. I think that we need 1,000 or 1 million flowers to bloom out there. I think individual agency is essential to this sector. And we can't ask everybody to give that up, right, in the interest of efficiency. But we do not need 1.8 million separate entities, separate boards, separate copier machines, separate accounting systems to manage that. That is what we don't need. And so, striking some balance in the middle of that spectrum, I think, is where the sector needs to go if we're going to maintain pluralism, but save a bunch of money. If you've attended I'll just say, I know we got to go, but the savings, we've done cost comparisons between standing alone and operating under a comprehensive sponsor, and it's about 50% of overhead that you save. in doing that. You know, and we're a $2+ trillion sector. You can do the math on how much more money we'd have for programs versus bookkeeping, accounting, compliance, and all the other things, right? So these are the things that we're really wrestling with, and I think our question here. But it's comfort and trust that's needed for folks to get into that more integrated, go down that path, you know, and that's a little bit more difficult. You know, arm's length is easier because it's more familiar, and there's not as much, you're not really giving up any real or perceived autonomy there, right? So that's a lot easier for people to do. So I think you need all of these solutions, you know, at hand. It's a toolbox, and the question is, what's the right one for you? So Dawn, any final? I know we're at our hour and want to make sure we get people off to their next commitment here. Any final thoughts?
I just really appreciate everybody being on the call and being willing to be on the learning journey. I think how we embrace these new ways of thinking about partnerships and collaborations is not only our responsibility to do so, but it's going to be the key to our future. So happy to be with everybody on this journey, and we will share more updates as we make progress in our work.
Great. Thank you all very much.